The man my father called a man who builds things for people who matter ended up building something my father never could, a home where a child never had to earn love to receive it. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest. I am not someone who enjoys looking back. I spent years trying not to. But last spring, when my mother appeared on the front porch of the house Marcus built with his own hands, shaking so hard her pearl earrings were trembling, I realized that some things don't stay buried no matter how deep you dig the hole. So let me start at the beginning. My father was Richard Hartwell. If you grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, you knew that name. Hartwell and Associates occupied the entire fourth floor of the Exchange Street building, the one with the carved stone archway that tourists always stop to photograph. My father had argued cases before the state Supreme Court 11 times. He won 9 of them. He kept a framed photograph of every single victory on the wall behind his desk, arranged in chronological order, the way some men keep hunting trophies. My mother, Diana Hartwell, had been a litigator herself before she stepped back to manage what she always called the family's public presence. She chaired 2 nonprofit boards, organized the annual Hartwell Scholarship Gala, and could walk into any restaurant in the city and be seated immediately. She wore her ambition the way other women wore perfume. You noticed it the moment she entered a room. I was their only daughter. My older brother, Carter, was already in his 2nd year at Duke Law when I started college at the College of Charleston. I was supposed to follow the same path: pre-law, law school, a clerkship, eventually, a corner office somewhere with my name on the door. The plan had been in place since I was old enough to understand what a plan was. I met Marcus Webb on a Tuesday in October of my sophomore year. The heating system in my off-campus apartment had stopped working, and my landlord sent over a contractor to look at it. I came home from class to find a man kneeling on my kitchen floor with the access panel open, a flashlight clenched between his teeth, and sawdust on the back of his flannel shirt. He looked up when I opened the door, took the flashlight out of his mouth, and said, "Give me 20 minutes and you'll have heat again." He was 23. He had started his own small contracting business the year before with a business partner and a used truck. He had calluses on his palms and a laugh that made you feel like you were in on something. He read history books on his lunch breaks and could talk for an hour about the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge without once making it boring. I was 20 years old, and I had never met anyone like him. We dated for 8 months before I told my parents. I knew what I was walking into. I had watched my father dismiss people my whole life, the way his voice went flat and polite when he encountered someone he considered beneath his consideration. I had seen it at charity events, at the country club, at family dinners when someone mentioned a cousin who had taken a job in retail. There was a particular silence my father deployed that was worse than any insult. He deployed it the night I brought Marcus to dinner. My mother asked Marcus where he had gone to school. Marcus told her he had done 2 years at Trident Technical College and gone straight into the trades. My father set down his fork, just set it down, quietly, and looked at the wall for a moment, the way he did in court when a witness said something he planned to dismantle later. The rest of dinner was polite and excruciating. When Marcus left, my father called me into his study and told me, without raising his voice, that I was making a mistake that would define my life in ways I was too young to understand. He said that a man who worked with his hands would always be limited by the nature of that work. He said that I was a Hartwell, that I had a name that meant something in this city, and that I owed it to that name to be more careful. My mother sat on the edge of the leather chair by the window and did not disagree with a single word. I drove home that night and sat in my car in the dark for a long time. Then I called Marcus. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "You want to come over? I just bought the ingredients for that chicken tortilla soup you like." I cried the whole drive there and felt better the moment I walked through his door. 4 months later, I found out I was pregnant. I was 20. Marcus was 23. We had been together for a year. I sat on the bathroom floor for a while after I saw the test, and then I called him, and he was there within 40 minutes, and the first thing he said when he walked in was, "We're going to be okay. Whatever you decide, we're going to be okay." I decided I wanted to keep the baby. Marcus held my hand and said that was what he wanted too. Telling my parents was the hardest phone call I have ever made. I remember my mother went completely silent. I remember my father asking me, in the same level tone he used in depositions, whether I understood what this meant for my future. I told him yes. He said he needed time to think. He called back 3 days later. He told me that he and my mother had discussed the situation and arrived at a decision. If I chose to continue the pregnancy with Marcus Webb, they would not be able to support that choice financially or otherwise. He was not threatening me, he said. He was being honest with me about reality. A Hartwell daughter with an illegitimate child by a contractor would damage the family in ways that could not be undone. If I came home, if I ended the pregnancy, if I enrolled in counseling and returned to the path I was supposed to be on, they would help me. Those were the terms. I was 11 weeks pregnant. I told my father that I loved him and that I was keeping my baby, and that I hoped one day he would understand why. He said, "Don't call this house asking for help later." And he hung up. I moved the rest of my things out of my apartment and into Marcus's place that weekend. My brother Carter sent me one text that said, "I'm sorry. I disagree with them, but I can't fight this right now." I never responded. I didn't have anything to say. Marcus proposed in December, 2 months before our daughter was born. We were eating cereal at the kitchen table at 7 in the morning, and he put a ring on top of my cereal box, a simple gold band with a small sapphire, because he had asked me once what my favorite color was, and I had said blue, and he said, "I've been trying to figure out the right moment, and I think any moment with you is the right moment." We were married in March, at the courthouse, with Marcus's mother and his 2 best friends as witnesses. It was 45 degrees and spitting rain, and I wore a blue dress I had bought for $38, and Marcus wore the nicest shirt he owned, and his mother cried through the whole thing, and it was, without question, one of the best days of my life. Our daughter Nora was born 6 weeks later. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, Marcus cried in the delivery room. Real, unashamed tears, the kind that come from somewhere you didn't know was that full. I watched him hold her for the first time, this man my father had dismissed as someone who would always be limited, and I thought, there is nothing limited about this. The first 2 years were hard in the way that young parenthood with no financial safety net is always hard. I finished my degree part-time while Nora was in daycare. Marcus and his business partner, Derek, took every job they could find. We ate a lot of rice and beans. We drove a truck with a check engine light that stayed on so long we stopped noticing it. We argued sometimes about money and exhaustion and the particular tension that comes from 2 people trying to hold everything up at once. But we also had Sunday mornings where Nora would climb into bed between us, and Marcus would do voices while reading picture books until she shrieked with laughter. We had evenings on the small back porch where we would sit with cheap wine after she went to sleep and talk about everything and nothing. We had a life that was ours, fully and completely ours, and no one had handed it to us. When Nora was 3, Marcus landed a contract to renovate a historic property in the Cannonboro neighborhood. It went well. The property owner referred him to a colleague. That referral led to another. By the time Nora started kindergarten, Webb Restoration and Construction had 4 full-time employees and a reputation for doing meticulous work on historic buildings. Charleston is a city that values its history, and Marcus understood old structures the way some people understand languages intuitively, almost emotionally. He could walk through a 19th-century house and tell you what it wanted to be. By Nora's 8th birthday, the business had 12 employees. They had been featured in a local architecture magazine. A developer from Columbia reached out about a major project. Marcus bought us a house in Hampton Park, an old craftsman bungalow that he spent 18 months restoring himself, on evenings and weekends, working alongside his crew. He refinished every floor by hand. He rebuilt the front porch from salvaged heart pine. He installed the kitchen cabinets himself. I had finished my degree and gone back to school for a master's in urban planning. I was working for a nonprofit focused on affordable housing development in the Low Country. It was not the path my father had drawn for me. It was better. We didn't hear from my parents for 9 years. My brother Carter reached out occasionally. A birthday text here, a holiday card there. He had become a lawyer, as planned, working at a firm in Columbia. We were cordial with each other in the careful way of people who once knew each other well and now exist in different worlds. He never apologized for choosing silence over his sister. I never asked him to. Then, on a Thursday evening in April, when Nora was 9 years old and I was helping her with a school project about South Carolina history at the kitchen table, my phone rang. The number was my parents' landline, the one I had not dialed in nearly a decade. I stared at it for 4 rings. Then I answered. It was my mother. Her voice was different. Not just older, something in it had collapsed, like a building where the internal supports have been quietly failing for years. She said my name, and then she said, "I need to talk to you." She asked if she could come and see me. She said she was in the city. I told her I needed to call her back. I put Nora to bed. I sat in the kitchen with Marcus across from me and told him what had happened, and he sat with his hands wrapped around a coffee mug and listened to everything, without saying a word, until I was finished. Then he said, "What do you want to do? Not what should you do. Not, what do you think she wants? What do you want?" I said I didn't know yet. My mother came to the house 2 days later. She stood on the porch Marcus had rebuilt from salvaged wood and looked at it for a moment before she knocked. When I opened the door, she looked at me the way you look at someone you've been carrying in a mental photograph for years and are now recalibrating against the reality in front of you. She had aged. She looked smaller than I remembered. She was wearing a coat I recognized from years ago. I let her in. I did not hug her. I made coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table and she looked around the house the way people look at something that challenges an assumption they've held for a long time. Then she told me why she had come. My father had been under investigation by the South Carolina Bar Association for 14 months. A former client had filed a grievance alleging that my father had improperly handled funds from an estate he was administering, a client who had died without close family, leaving a substantial estate that my father had been managing for 7 years. The bar's investigation had uncovered irregularities. My father had not stolen money, she was careful to say. But he had made decisions about how funds were managed and invested that he had not disclosed to the estate's beneficiaries, and some of those decisions had benefited a real estate partnership that my father had a quiet ownership stake in. There were also the firm's finances. The real estate market had been rough. They had overextended on a commercial property investment 3 years before. They had been managing the shortfall quietly, and they had not been managing it well. The firm had 2 partners and 7 associates, and for the past 18 months, my parents had been quietly selling assets to stay operational. The house on Trad Street, the one where I had grown up, the one with the oil portraits in the hallway, and the garden my mother had spent 20 years cultivating, was on the market. My father was facing possible suspension, maybe disbarment. I listened to all of it. I watched my mother fold and unfold her hands on my kitchen table. I noticed that she was not wearing her good watch. When she finished, I said, "What is it you're asking me for?" She looked at her hands. "Your father won't come himself. It's hard for him, but we need help. We don't have anywhere else to turn." "What kind of help?" She said it carefully. "They needed a place to stay while the house sold. They needed," and here she paused and looked at me, "they needed to know that I hadn't closed the door completely." That was how she put it. That the door wasn't completely closed. I thought about my father on the phone 9 years ago. "Don't call this house asking for help later." I thought about the ring Marcus had balanced on top of a cereal box because he knew I would find romance in ordinary moments more than grand gestures. I thought about Nora. I told my mother I needed time to think. She left her number, a cell phone I didn't have, and she stood up and looked around the kitchen once more. At the window over the sink, where I had hung Nora's drawings on a string with little wooden clips, at the table where a half-finished school project about South Carolina rice plantations was still spread out. She said, "You have a beautiful home." It came out like an admission. I talked to Marcus that night for a long time. He said, as he always said, that it was my decision, that he would support whatever I chose, but that there were things he wanted to say if I wanted to hear them. I said I did. He said that he had never needed my parents' approval, and he didn't need it now. He said that whatever I decided about them had nothing to do with him or with Nora unless I chose to make it so. He said that he had watched me build a life from the ground up with no help from the people who were supposed to give it, and that I had done it, and that nothing they were going through now changed anything about that. Then he said something I have thought about many times since. He said, "The question isn't whether they deserve your help. The question is, what kind of person you want to be, on your own terms. Not because of them. For yourself, I slept on it for 4 days. Then I called Nora into the living room and talked to her. She was 9, old enough to understand more than most adults give children credit for. I told her that my parents, her grandparents, she had never met, were going through a hard time, and that I was thinking about whether to help them. I did not tell her the whole story. I told her enough. I told her that they had made a choice a long time ago that had hurt me, and that I was still figuring out what to do with that. Nora sat cross-legged on the couch and thought about it with the particular seriousness she always brought to things she considered important. Then she said, "Mom, do you think they're sorry? Like actually sorry, not just scared sorry." 9 years old. I told her I didn't know yet. She said, "I think you should find out before you decide." I called my mother back. I told her I was not offering them a place to stay, we didn't have the space, and I wasn't ready for that. But I told her that I was willing to meet again, with my father this time. There was a pause. Then she said, "I'll tell him." My father came on a Sunday afternoon. He sat in the same chair my mother had sat in, and he looked like a man who had spent a long time coming down off of something. He was 71. He looked older. He looked, for the first time in my memory, like someone who was not certain of the outcome before the proceedings began. He did not apologize the way I had imagined he might, in the years when I used to imagine it. He didn't have a speech. He sat down and he looked at his hands and he said, "I was wrong about Marcus. I was wrong about what I said to you. I have thought about it for a long time." He stopped. "That's not enough. I know that. But I don't have anything bigger to offer you right now." I believed him. Not because the words were eloquent. Because they weren't. I told him that I was not going to pretend 9 years hadn't happened. I told him that Marcus was not someone who required his approval or his retroactive acceptance, and that if he came into our lives, he would treat Marcus with the same respect he would give any man who had built something real from nothing. I told him that Nora was not a prop for a reconciliation narrative, that she was a person with her own feelings about grandparents she had never known, and that her comfort came before his need to make things right on a timeline that was convenient for him. My father nodded. He didn't argue with any of it. Then I told him I had spoken to a colleague at work who specialized in legal ethics cases, not to intercede but to understand. I told him what she had told me, that cooperation with the bar investigation, full transparency, and genuine restitution where possible were the only paths toward any kind of salvageable outcome, that the cover-up, as it always did, had become worse than the original mistake. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I know. I did not let my parents move in. I did not write a check, or make a call, or smooth anything over. That was not what they needed from me, and it was not what I had to give. What I gave them, slowly and imperfectly, over the following months, was a door that was open slightly Sunday dinners twice a month, Nora meeting her grandfather for the first time over a plate of barbecue, my mother learning that her granddaughter liked drawing architectural sketches because she had grown up watching her father see the potential in old structures. Marcus shook my father's hand the first time they were in the same room. Firm, brief, no performance. My father looked at Marcus the way you look at something you misjudged for so long that correcting the error is genuinely embarrassing. Marcus asked him about the Hartwell Building's original architecture, and my father, almost involuntarily, began talking about the stonework. It was not a redemption. It was not a reconciliation in any Hollywood sense. My father had his license suspended for 8 months. The firm restructured. The house on Trad Street sold. My parents moved to a smaller place in Mount Pleasant, and lived, for the first time, within their actual means. What changed was smaller and more real than any grand gesture. It was the slow, difficult work of 2 people trying to become honest with themselves late in life, and a daughter deciding not for them, for herself, that she was capable of witnessing that process without letting it cost her anything else. Nora asked me once, when she was 10, whether I was glad my parents had come back. I told her it was complicated. She said she understood, and I think she did. What I am glad about is simpler. I am glad that I married a man who asked me what I wanted, every single time, before he told me what he thought. I am glad that I watched him build things with his hands and understand, somewhere in my core, that the building of things is as worthy as the arguing of things, that craftsmanship and care are a form of intelligence my father's world never bothered to learn the language of. I am glad that Nora grew up in a house where love was not a performance or a condition or a bargaining chip, where it was just steady, present. The way a well-built structure is present. Not loud, not decorative. Load-bearing. Last summer, Marcus was asked to speak at a preservation conference in Savannah. He was one of 5 recipients of the state's Historic Preservation Award. He stood at the podium, in a jacket he had pressed himself that morning, and he talked about his first job, replacing rotted siding on a Victorian in the Wagner Terrace neighborhood, how the previous owner had covered original heart pine floors with linoleum because they didn't know what was underneath, how so much of what he did for a living was revealing what was already there, under layers of decisions made by people who didn't know what they had. I was sitting in the 3rd row. Nora was next to me. She leaned over during his speech and whispered, "Dad's really good at this." I squeezed her hand. When Marcus walked off stage, he found us in the crowd and hugged Nora first, the way he always had, and then he hugged me and said into my hair, "You good?" And I said yes. And it was the truest thing I said all day. My father sent Marcus a handwritten card that week. I don't know exactly what was in it. Marcus read it and put it in the drawer where he keeps things that matter to him. Our marriage certificate, Nora's first drawing of a house, a photograph of his mother taken the year before she passed. He didn't make a thing of it. That was the point. There's something I want to say to anyone who has been told that the person they love is not enough, not impressive enough, not credentialed enough, not the right last name or the right profession or the right kind of success. I want to say, success that requires other people's diminishment to sustain itself is not success. It is fear in an expensive frame. The man my parents dismissed built a business that employs 23 people. He restored a 19th century schoolhouse in North Charleston that now serves as a community arts center. He coached Nora's soccer team for 6 years and was the father every kid on that team wanted to talk to because he listened like what they said was worth hearing. He has never once, in all the years I have known him, made someone feel small to make himself feel larger. I think about what my father said that night long ago, that Marcus would always be limited by the nature of his work. I think about how wrong that was, and I think about all the ways my father was limited by the nature of his, by the way that world trained him to believe that worth was a ranking system, that love was a resource to be allocated strategically, that a daughter's life was a reflection rather than a separate and sovereign thing. I don't say this to be cruel. I say it because I think the most useful thing I can do with what happened to me is be honest about what I learned from it. What I learned is this: the people who build things, who show up, who use their hands, who make something real out of raw materials and patience and skill, those people are not beneath anyone. They are, in many of the ways that count, the foundation the rest of us are standing on. My husband knew that from the beginning. It took my father most of a lifetime to begin to understand it. Nora has known it her whole life, because she grew up watching her father work. I think that's the thing I'm most grateful for. Not the awards, not the business, not even the house with the heart pine floors. The fact that my daughter grew up knowing, in her bones, that how you treat people, all people, regardless of what they do, or what they earn, or where they went to school, is the only resume that actually matters in the end. She's 12 now. She already has a notebook full of building sketches. She told Marcus last fall that she wants to restore old buildings like he does, and he smiled the way he smiled when she was born, that full and unguarded smile, and he said, "I'll teach you everything I know." I stood in the kitchen doorway and watched them bend over her notebook together, his big hand pointing at the lines she'd drawn, her face tilted up toward him with complete attention. And I thought, this is what I chose. I would choose it again without hesitation.